some type of an image, or if we're going to use USMT and the intermediate, we've got to have a server in place and a share in place to be able to pull that data across. So those initial two, when we look at the in place, are going to be the ones that you see. Advantages and disadvantages. Obviously there's not going to be a requirement for new hardware. We don't have to have space for migration with the in place, because we're going to essentially just do an upgrade. We're going to keep our application settings. Our configurations will remain intact for our users. And then we can go back in and configure Windows 7 to run unattended, because it natively will do that upgrade for us, or we can use some type of an answer file, as we'll see in 5, to automate that process a little bit as well. Wipe and load. When we start to go back in here, we certainly have the option to go back in and to use reference configurations by taking our USMT data off. It does allow us, because we're partitioning the machine, to start again cleanly. So if there were things on the machine, or we had registry issues or whatever it might be, we can go ahead and start clean from that, as we mentioned before. And it does give us the option to create kind of that standard image without necessarily going back through the upgrade. So they both have their advantages and disadvantages. And again, I think a lot of this is pretty straightforward for you in going through. Considerations, obviously the infrastructure, your access to the machines, how you're going to deploy the images comes into play. You also have to consider that when we go back in, the budget. Are we going to purchase new hardware? How much do we need to automate the deployment? Do we need to allocate resources to be at every single machine to try to go through it? All of that certainly comes into play. The phase of the desktop, what place are we in as far as being able to keep existing applications? Do we have a lot of compatibility testing to do? Do we have additional applications that need to be reconfigured? So all of that certainly would be something that you'll take into place. Time considerations, the amount of time that you're going to spend going in and doing the deployment. Do we have new hardware? Do we have the option to purchase new hardware? Again, all of that kind of comes in there as well. Some other things that your materials point out for you, when you go back in, kind of on the wipe and load options, we do have the Windows Easy Transfer, which essentially is a graphical way to automate the user state migration. So if your users are at a point where they can participate, or they can help you with some of that, or they have the ability to do that, might save us a little bit of work on the ability to transfer files off and on the machine. And then they'll also point out how we can use answer files to customize a little bit. Hang on to that. We certainly will talk about it. And that goes more into the amount of interaction that you'll see right here, because we can build specific answer files for different departments and different locations to customize how that in-place deployment is going to proceed for you. Side by side, advantages, disadvantages. Certainly by being able to go back in, what we're doing is we're taking information from one machine, and we're going to go back in and we're going to place that information on another machine. So instead of using existing hardware, we again are going to have new hardware or different hardware that we're going to be using for our new OS. Pretty straightforward. We want to make sure that we clean up the source machine as much as we possibly can. You have to remember that when you begin the process of taking user state, the cleaner you can get the source machine, the cleaner that user state migrated data is going to be. The smaller the amount of information that you have to take and then reapply will be. So we certainly want to take the opportunity to clean this machine up as much as we possibly can prior to pulling off that user state data. Once the user state information is pulled off, then we'll have a share out here on the network. And that's exactly what it is. And this will be a whack server name, share name, where you're going to take that scan state data, you're going to store it right over here, and then as we go through the process of installing the new OS, we're going to run our load state information. Our load state information will take the migrated profile information, the files, the folders, whatever it might be that we've taken, and then it's going to go ahead and reapply those to the desktop machine for us. Certainly the advantages, We've got a clean OS. We've got new hardware that we have in place as well, and it certainly allows us to begin the process of starting, about as clean as we possibly could with the new operating system. Certainly it does require new hardware. Applications might need to be reinstalled in the event and reconfigured, excuse me. Although a lot of the configuration data should come across with your user profile, there's always a chance that we might have to go back in and reconfigure some of those settings for our users, as we point out down here for you as well. Okay. So again, I think like the previous section, pretty straightforward, and certainly the advantages and the disadvantages are nicely laid out for you in your materials as well. From an infrastructure perspective, we're going to have a way to make sure that we can run the executable or the installation, whether it's going to be a network share, or we've got the operating system files, whether somebody's going to be present at the machine, or whether we're going to use some type of a method to automate the deployment. We have the three options: the setup, the network shares we talked about. Windows Deployment Services obviously is going to be able to be used as well for the infrastructure components of going through the install. Configuration Manager also can be put into place with all of these. From a budget perspective, again, additional costs in going back in and purchasing new hardware has to be considered. And then from there, as we mentioned in the previous one, the different phase of the desktop. Where are we on the life cycle as far as the operating system, the hardware, the applications that are going to be installed? Have we taken the time to make sure that things are going to be compatible? All will come into play there as well. The amount of interaction, depending on how we set this up, our users might be required to do a little bit of configuration. They might be required to do no configuration. As we've mentioned, we certainly have the ability to do answer files right here in this section. So if we use an answer file, we can automate the configuration of Internet Explorer, favorites, those types of things. We can also, as we mentioned, use USMT to pull profile data. The profile data will take settings for applications so that hopefully when we reapply it, our users won't have to go back in and do a whole lot of reconfiguration. Although if we're going from Office 2007 to Office 2010, there certainly will be a little bit of work that they're going to have to do for configuration of new settings and things of that nature. And then, as we talked about before, the state of the user data certainly will come into play. Taking the time to clean things up, making sure that file types, excluded files, locations of data, the things that we expect to take and migrate over are as clean as we possibly can. Mentioned in the last section, we'll say it again, like everything else, what we take and what we reapply, will then be reapplied, and certainly making sure that what we take is as clean as we possibly can have it will make a huge difference on the back end when we begin to reapply that information. So all of those things in any of the deployments will need to be taken into account. So if we go through it, your materials give you a quick little discussion on just some thoughts on the different deployment scenarios, your in place, your wipe and load, your side by sides, and again, I'll go through this pretty quickly. I think it's fairly straightforward. I'll leave that for you as a discussion topic that we can take offline, or we can go into breakout if you'd like some additional information. But we'll kind of leave that as is. We get into the step up from CD-based, DVD-based installation, and the first one that we'll talk about is our light touch deployment. And your light touch deployment really is going in and is using, in most cases, Windows Deployment Services, or taking advantage of being able to go back in and using the deployment toolkit. So what we're trying to build is a solution that provides a combination of answer files, a combination of user state migration, and a combination of images to automate the installation as much as we possibly can. So we're trying to limit the interaction from our users so they don't have to do a whole lot. We're trying to make it as easy as we can for ourselves, and then we're also trying to get to a place where we've got standardized deployments, where everybody gets a Windows 7 base machine with Office 2007 or Office 2010, and then we certainly can begin the process of adding additional applications if we need to. We want to try to make the deployments as quick as we possibly can, either through the desktop deployment kit or through deployment services, as we'll see, without having to go out and spend a ton of money over here on additional or third-party software to do it. So we want to get away from having to use Altiris, or we want to get away from having to use Ghost, and we want to try to use existing operating system components that are included in our licensing agreements to get these things done. What are the tools that we'll end up using for Light Touch? Well, as we go through a little bit, we'll see that they'll depend on a few different things. Are we going to have the ability to use kind of a basic, do we have a group that can help us go in and do the deployment? Can we touch every single machine, if you will? If we can't do it, then we have to spend a little more time on the back end to try to automate our back end, our infrastructure, by using the tools like the application compatibility toolkit, by using tools like the deployment toolkit or the automated installation toolkit for deployment services in USMT. We certainly can get all of these to a point where we don't have to have a lot of interaction from our users, or certainly from our group or from our department, if we can get this thing to where it's just rolling out in a fairly straightforward and efficient manner. Okay. So zero touch then gets us to the point where with deployment services and with the desktop deployment, we have to have somebody there to do it. We have to have somebody with this scenario where I've got either WDS or I've got the deployment toolkit here, where essentially I've got an image share. Somebody is going to have to be there somewhere over here on this client machine to hit F12 at the minimum. Or somebody's going to have, and this is my picture of a CD or a DVD, to put that in, to boot, to connect to the network, and then to download this ISO file right here. Let's do this, because to download 7.wim, excuse me. Okay, so somebody would have to go back in and put in that boot WIM file, which would be Windows PE, and then they go through the process of connecting to this Windows 7 image to begin the deployment. So with Light Touch, I've got a little bit of interaction down here. Now, the way that this will work, and we'll continue to reinforce this. This boot WIM file that we're looking at, right down here, this is going to be Windows PE. So you're putting in Windows PE, or you're getting Windows PE to that client in some fashion, whether it's you with a USB drive or a CD or a DVD that you're booting into. And then after you go ahead and you boot that client, your next step is to tell it what or where you're going to go in and apply this Windows 7 image from. So if we look at this right here with just the deployment toolkit, with just this option right there, I would boot to the Windows PE boot disk. I would then go in and I'd have to map a network drive. Windows PE natively will install the NDIS drivers. So it would take me, after it booted up, to the X drive. So you would be sitting on a client with the X drive right there. A little graphical Windows PE in the background sitting at X. So then you'd have to type in netuse Z:, or whatever drive you wanted, Z:// whack server name, share name. So by mapping the Z drive over here, so we'll take it, and we've now mapped Z to right over here. Now you can begin the process of going in and running the tool to apply this Windows 7 image that you've already created, which is going to be a tool called ImageX. And ImageX is Microsoft's image capture and image apply tool. So we would do ImageX space / apply Z:\7.wim. And there's some other parameters. We could tell it what partition to apply to, so on and so forth. But the problem with that, again, there's a lot of manual interaction. And we're going to create our Windows PE boot disk in just a little bit. So we're going to create this. And then we're also obviously going to go in and create a Windows 7 image that we can use to boot and go through this process. So this will be one of the first heavier labs that you do, 5, 6, and 7. And then once we do this, once we get past this point where we say, okay, that's great, we created our boot disk, we added ImageX to it, we booted, we mapped a network drive, and we then went back in and applied an image. We look at it and we think, okay, well, there's a lot of manual work involved in that. I don't have to go to every single machine to put in my Windows PE boot disk to boot out to essentially a file share where I then can apply the image. So if we want to automate it a little bit, then what we can do is we can take Windows Deployment Services, and that takes us kind of to the next step. Because Windows Deployment Services, instead of having to have a boot WIM on local media, Deployment Services allows us to take this boot WIM that we're going to look at right here, this file right there, and we can take that and we can put that boot WIM right over here in Deployment Services. So now WDS, when you hit F12, will download that boot WIM to that machine for you. So by doing that, you get away from having to have that x86 Windows PE or x64 Windows PE boot disk with you everywhere you go. You simply hit F12, you select the boot image that you want, it downloads to the client machine. From there, we're able to go back in and select what Windows 7 image, and our Windows 7 image would also be deployed through Deployment Services. Now that process could be automated through a combination of answer files as well. But if y'all will look at that for me, we're still in a place where, somebody has to be there to hit F12. Somebody has to be there to activate that PXE boot, unless we've got our clients configured in the BIOS. Perhaps we've made a change where their initial boot is going to be to F12, or we've got some type of a hardware-based option where we can remotely navigate that or control that. There's still some interaction from our end on going in and deploying those. Okay, so those two options, when you look at that, are what we would consider to be our light touch, in that they're not completely automated, right? So light touch with more work, so I would say light touch kind of option A is just using the toolkit, which allows us to create a file share or a series of file shares where we can place our boot images, our Windows 7 operating system images, and additional applications that we might choose to deploy as well. And I want to take a moment and just break that out for you so that you can really understand what you're doing when you install the deployment toolkit. This is a standalone machine. It could be a Windows 7 client. And on this machine, when you install the deployment toolkit, what it does for you is it creates a default series of shares and folders. And so we'll have a folder that's got right over here, we'll say WinPE. And in WinPE is where your boot WIM files would be, your Windows PE boot images, if you will. And then from there, once we got that, then the next thing that it'll do, it'll create an OS share for you. And in your OS share is where you would go back in and you would store your OS images. And then it also creates for you an app share there. So this is where your Office, etc., could be located. In our job from here now becomes to take what we find in this Windows PE directory here, which will be our default Windows PE source files, and to create some type of a bootable image. Microsoft gives us a couple of tools. There's a BCD tool, there's a DSM tool that we're going to DISM tool that we're going to look at. So they provide these tools for us to build this bootable WinPE boot CD or boot DVD. And by using those tools, then we can create this right here. So you're going in, you can take the boot WIM file that you create, you can put it on a USB drive, you can make an ISO out of it and get it to a CD, then you go to the client and you boot, and when you boot, as I mentioned before, you have to manually map that network drive. So you have to go back in and you have to say, connect to, in this case it would be our operating system share. And then after you connect to the operating system share, then you have to select the image, and you can use ImageX to apply that image from there. So again, the deployment toolkit gives you the tools you need to create the image, the boot image, to create your operating system images, to be able to go back in and either through a combination of answer files or a combination of task sequences, which we'll look at as well, to deploy existing images and applications. But it's a very, there's a lot of manual work involved. Now, you certainly can build scripts that will automate the process of mapping the drive. So when you boot into the CD, maybe you have a Visual Basic script that kicks off, and that VB script automates the process of mapping the Z drive for you. And then maybe you have another script that goes in and selects the image. So you certainly can automate that process a little bit if you choose to. Okay, but that's really what you're doing with the deployment toolkit. And we will build these images in section 5. That's what you're going to be working with. You're going to be working with this combination of tools. Okay. Any questions on that from a light touch, or why we call it a light touch, if you will? All right. So our next step up, our second option we talked about is deployment services. And deployment services, again, the upgrade to RIS, the big advantage that it provides for us is that it does allow us to take that boot WIM file and those images that we've created and to host them in an environment where we have a PXE boot, an automated boot sequence, so that we don't have to go to the machine, pop in the CD or pop in the USB drive or whatever it may be to begin the deployment process. But think about what I just said to you. Y'all, somehow that boot WIM file still has to get to deployment services. So somebody still has to go in and create that WinPE boot disk that we load into WDS. So we're still going to use the deployment toolkit to create that boot WIM file. The only difference is after we create it, instead of saying we're going to put it on a USB drive or we're going to put it on a CD drive or a DVD, we're going to put it in a deployment services share. And then we do the same thing with our operating system images. So those operating system images, instead of being right over here in this share, what we're going to do is we're going to take that Windows 7 WIM file that we created, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to load that into a Windows deployment services share so we can automate the process. Okay, so just because we get deployment services doesn't mean that we don't need the toolkit or we don't need some of these other tools that we're going to go through to begin the process of building these images and to use these images. Does that make sense to you? Any questions on how that works? Okay, good. And we'll keep we'll keep putting that we'll keep going over, and we'll keep making sure that reinforcing that, because if you can understand how all these pieces fit into place, then when we start breaking down each one of these tools, it makes it very, very simple and very straightforward for you to follow along and to really begin digging into some of these things. Now, although we're going to go in and we're going to manually create our boot WIM file, and we're going to go through the process of manually using these options, I will show you a couple of different tools that you can use as well to automate the image capture process and to automate some of these things for you. Okay. All right. So that's what we look at with our light touch. And then when we start to get into zero touch takes it to the next level. If we go one step up from Windows Deployment Services, zero touch allows us to fully automate everything that we've just discussed. And so if we come right down here and we go into our zero touch is making the assumption now that we've got something else in place. And that something else that zero touch says, hey, you need to have in place is going to be Configuration Manager. And with Configuration Manager in the zero touch deployment, there are two options that we have. And the first option ends up being a place where we've got our client down here. So maybe this is good old XP. And then we have a Configuration Manager agent or an SMS legacy 2003 agent perhaps that's sitting down here. So our agent is sitting right here just waiting for an advertisement to be deployed. And Configuration Manager will take that Windows 7 image that we talked about with WDS, and that 7 WIM, instead of us taking it and putting it into WDS, we bundle this into a Configuration Manager package. So by taking it and bundling it into a package, then what we can do is we can advertise. And when we advertise that package, we advertise it through something called a task sequence. And we will do all of this. You're going to have the opportunity as we proceed through the course to do all three of these. You're going to do a standard image build. You're going to do a deployment toolkit, kind of a manual install. Then you'll do Windows Deployment Services. Then we're going to do Configuration Manager. But what we're doing is we're creating a task sequence, and a task sequence is a honey-do list for how we want to install this. So you advertise the task sequence down here to the agent, and the agent says, hey, I need to go ahead and they're telling me that I need to go ahead and begin the process of installing an image. So we know that in order to install an image, we have to boot into this. So these files that we've been working with and we've created can be hosted and can be placed in all these different places. We had them initially on a file share with the Deployment Toolkit. Then we put them into Deployment Services to give us a little more automation. Then we're going to put them into Configuration Manager to completely automate the entire process. So the task sequence says the first thing you need to do, so number one, is to come right here, and you need to copy down this boot WIM file. So you're gonna copy this down, and you're gonna boot into Windows PE. And then from there, the task sequence says, once you get into Windows PE, then you need to go ahead and maybe you need to repartition the drive. So you need to run this part to repartition this, because we know that the Windows 7 partition is bigger, it needs to be bigger than the XP partition. And then after you go through the process of partitioning this, then I need you to go back in. So 2 would be disk part here in the task sequence. Then I want you to go back in in step 3, and I want you to go ahead and now begin the process of installing the image. When you're finished with that, then I want you to go back in and perhaps install any other apps in 4 that we might have in packages out there waiting to be installed from Configuration Manager. We could also build a task sequence in this. So maybe before we wipe the machine clean in DiskPart, we run USMT. So we pull off the user profile information. So certainly USMT could be incorporated into these task sequences as well. And by doing it that way, we completely automate it. We can advertise this task sequence to collections, which are groups of machines. We can automate the entire process from the ground up, which is where we get this zero touch that we discuss. Okay. So each one of those areas, each one of those places that we look at gives you an option to get farther and farther away from a place where you have to be manually involved in deploying the images. Okay, so Desktop Deployment Toolkit, essentially the tools to create your WinPE boot disk, the tools to create an image and to capture the image, which will be ImageX, the tools to go in and essentially create the file share where your newly captured image will be kept. But you do have some manual work, a lot of manual interaction to kick it off. So we go to the next step, which is going to be deployment services, and deployment services gives us that F12 boot, and then obviously Configuration Manager will take it from there. Yes, Melanie. Can you absolutely? What we end up doing with Configuration Manager is you advertise the task sequence to a machine or to a collection. So you certainly could create multiple task sequences, but you're only going to advertise one task sequence at a time. So that task sequence, say we could have a task sequence for marketing, where we're going in and installing the 7 image, and then we're going to go back in and make a call to the marketing applications during the task sequence to make sure that the marketing apps get there. And then we could have another one that goes back in. We have a task sequence for our IT machines or our human resources machines with different options and different things being installed. Other places where you'll see different task sequences used, maybe you have different driver packages that you'd like to install as well. So I'll show you a lot of this, and we'll certainly go through and take a look at it. But yes, you can have as many task sequences as you want. But remember, when you decide to advertise, you're only advertising one task sequence to that agent. Having said that, your task sequences can be, you can have a task sequence at some point calling another task sequence if you choose to. So you can nest them or chain them, but you can only advertise a single one. Did that get it, Millie? Okay. So, any thoughts on that process of how those things go through and how you're going to be able to use the 3 different methods, the light touch, the 2 options, the deployment toolkit, the WDS, and then the zero touch, obviously going towards Configuration Manager Automated. All right, we don't have. If you look into your materials, you've got some planning worksheets and exercises. I'm going to leave that. We're going to hang on to that. We'll come back to this as we move towards the end of the week, but there's no hands-on. It's all the things that we've talked about as far as what deployment method you might choose to use in different environments. And it really comes down to, like we talked about, the budget, infrastructure, how many physical machines you're going to have, if you feel like going to every single machine and putting in a DVD or a USB drive, and the labs for these next 2 or that type of thing. So I'll go over the planning worksheets with you at some point. I'll show you where those are going to be located, but you don't have any actual labs that correspond to this. So we're going to take a quick stretch. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. We're going to come back in, and we're going to go into Section 4. And we're going to look at the tools that are going to be involved in building initially and automating our images. We're going to talk about the WIM files. We're going to talk about ImageX. We're going to talk about Windows PE. We'll go through it in a similar fashion as we covered this, because pretty quickly we're going to get into actually doing a lot of these things and creating our initial images with our desktop deployment toolkit and the AIC in Section 5. Okay, so 10-minute break. I'll be here to answer any questions you have them. When you come back in, we're gonna jump very, very quickly into Section 4.